bo będziemy mieli element muzyczny na scenie. Za chwilę na scenę zaproszę Lukasa Henninga, którego możecie na co dzień oglądać na YouTubie, odgrywającego na lutni stare utwory. A dzisiaj będziemy mieli okazję zobaczyć jego prezentację i posłuchać muzyki na żywo tutaj ze sceny na Digital Cultures. Lukas, welcome.
All right, thank you very much. So, let's start by imagining a parallel reality where pigment is impermanent. So only a short time after the paint has dried on the canvas, it disappears like this ink that you can buy in a toy store. So to be an artist in this world means to perform the painting for an audience. And for preserving these works, a kind of notational system had to be invented. But of course, there's no permanent ink, and always writing with that old system invented by the ancient Sumerians turned out to be not very practical over time. So in the year 1439, the German blacksmith Johannes Gutenberg made a very important invention, the Apple II with a monochrome display and floppy drive. But many years later, in 1977, when the first color displays were introduced, some students read about the famous artist Caravaggio on an archive. And they're curious to see what the paintings of this influential artist look like. So they download the score of one of his portraits and ask 5 different painters to each perform the work from this original score. But the last person who actually saw Caravaggio work, of course, died centuries ago, so nobody really knows what it looked like. And while the first painter has talent, they don't really know so much about this 16th century style of notation, and so it doesn't really get there all the way. The second one knows more about the notation, but never really got into the Renaissance so much, so they get the feeling kind of wrong. The third painter is inspired by what they saw the first painter do, but they are just really shit at using a brush, so it doesn't work. The fourth painter agrees with the students that this Caravaggio, I don't know, it's a little lame, a bit boring, it's not as good as the modern artists are, so they decide to make it a bit more interesting. But now the fifth painter is from the Institute for Historical Performance Practice of Figurative Arts, where they scientifically reconstruct all the methods and the tools and materials that Caravaggio used and how he really did it based on hard scientific facts. Despite all of this, our alternate reality has a group of enthusiasts, the so-called early painting scene, who are very interested in the works of these old artists, and they often attend performances of masterpieces by Rembrandt or Leonardo da Vinci. Fortunately for us, we don't live in that hellish parallel dimension. There's no early painting scene. And we all know what Caravaggio's painting actually looks like. But maybe this parable illustrates why you likely never heard of the composer Jacques Arcadelt, who wrote the song that's featured on this painting, unless you are part of the early music scene, of course. So back in March here in Warsaw, the exhibition Time Regained addressed some of the issues that early music faces today by assembling a wide range of different visual materials on 10 big plates, thematically ordered plates, accompanied by a catalog in which Björn Schmelzer, the director of the vocal ensemble Grande La Voix, questions this historicist approach of sticking to so-called hard facts about how music really sounded back then to construct a kind of scientific authority on the topic. The 9th plate, called The Politics of Polyphony, mentions some of the darker aspects that still actually lie at the foundation of today's early music movement, which is actually has been characterized by a more liberal, almost sort of left-wing image since the 70s. The subtle underlying problem is that when you gather a bunch of young Flemish men to sing Flemish polyphony, or German organists to play Bach in German churches, or you find some Middle Eastern musicians and let them play together with Spanish musicians in Alhambra in Granada to get a really authentic take on the songs in the Cantigas de Santa Maria, there's this seemingly harmless idea of us rediscovering the music of our ancestors, our roots, hearing the voices of the past. But this exact thought reveals that the perceived relevance of this kind of music, why we have to listen to it today, has in fact an identitarian aspect. And with the current political climate, this leaves a bad aftertaste, to say the least, no matter how good the intentions are. In the catalogue of Time Regained, Björn Schmelzer argues that with music itself being something virtual, the historicist reliance on so-called hard facts is bound to run into dead ends, and instead proposes a dialectical approach where he superimposes several, perhaps even contradictory images of what could potentially have been. Hence, his choice to adopt a format first described about 100 years ago by the art historian Abi Warburg, who spread different visual materials on a surface to evoke what he calls Zwischenraum, the beholder subconsciously filling the space in between images. The driving force behind this phenomenon is perhaps best described with the concept that Marcel Proust called involuntary memory, where certain stimuli can trigger sudden recollection of things we perhaps never even experienced, like, for example, the way the music that Caravaggio heard sounded like. So, the project that I've been invited to present here operates on a similar principle, but in a modern medium. Memo is a series of video essays I began about 2 years ago with the intention of presenting early music and art history in a wider scope and connecting it to our lives today. In fact, this presentation here at the Digital Cultures Conference is episode number 24. It's a kind of live Memo special, so hello to everybody watching from home. Usually my format with Memo is to explore different topics by juxtaposing music with particular styles of art. So for example, in one of the episodes I have John Dowland's dance music and Nicholas Hilliard's miniature portraits at the court of Queen Elizabeth I in an episode about social networking. Or for example, I have the madrigals of Cipriano de Rore and Titian's late painting style to discuss aesthetics of impurity. Or there's Vincenzo Capirola's Venetian lute compositions in this manuscript and the marginalia in illuminated manuscripts to explore the mechanics of virtual reality, even without having a computer. What's important to me is to constantly be introducing new associations, sticking to a general theme, but keeping things as eclectic as possible, and also making sure to always have some kind of musical performance in every episode. So for example, for the England episode, we made this song in sort of Dowland style, referencing Shakespeare and Brexit.
This bond by sad tears of greatness past our bed, 100 hands with thunderous clap despair. This band by sad tears of greatness past our bed, 100 hands with thunderous clap despair.
So, I'm sure you noticed that the selection of different materials that I use for Memo is really kind of eclectic. In order to keep all the stuff together, I narrate throughout each of the episodes, as is common in the so-called video essay format, which is often confused with a kind of tutorial where things are explained to you. But that's exactly what I'm trying to avoid. I also have very nice graphics in every episode. What I want to avoid is telling you what to think about all of this. Instead, it's more about providing some sort of temporal binding agent for the different materials, so they can develop this effect that Abi Warburg called Zwischenraum, and you, the viewers, can explore it on your own terms, like a kind of multimedia Warburg atlas. It might seem like this kind of format would already have been possible, let's say, 20 years ago, but in fact, I'd argue that this exact way of working only really came to be in the last 5 years, maybe, since we have seen this huge wave of rapid digitization of materials, of historical documents in immense quantities, with many of the institutions making their archives openly accessible online. This allows for a style of research that would simply have been impossible some years ago. Let's say I happened to be researching people who lived exactly 500 years before myself for some specific episode of Memo. And on Wikipedia, I stumbled upon Francesco de Laiol, a relatively obscure composer who was born in 1492, so exactly 500 years before myself. I do a quick Google search and add the term painting, skim the results. On page 3, the preview text for a PDF on JSTOR attracts my attention. Since I graduated a couple of years ago, I'm not anymore a member of any institution with a JSTOR subscription, so instead of actually reading the PDF, I just Google Laiol Caravaggio. On page 1, I find a mention in the catalog for a 1990 Caravaggio exhibition that the Metropolitan Museum of Art scanned and uploaded. The reason that the exact page where it mentions Laiol comes up in my search results is that Google Books automatically performed optic character recognition on the whole PDF. So I quickly read the section, take some notes, download a high-resolution image of the Wikimedia service. I zoom in, I flip, and there we have the Madrigal by Laiol. Now I Googled the print mentioned in the catalog and find the exact 1544 edition Caravaggio painted in 1596 on the servers of a Florentine library. Now I take a look if there's perhaps a lute transcription of that song that I could perform in my video. And of course, the British Library has a print from 1546 containing a lute version by Giovanni da Crema. But it only lets me view the page. There's no download button because I guess it doesn't really comply with the user agreement or something. So I hope I don't get myself into trouble by saying that usually my response to something like this is just to say F it and make a screenshot. And then I use it. So now we're going to have a little performance of that thing we just found on the internet, on the original instrument. Thanks. So that's what was there. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, the point that I'm trying to make is that the whole process from a vague random idea that I had to the original source, the original print, takes about, well, let's say half an hour. Without having to write a single email requesting materials from a library or acquiring the rights, having to mail order expensive and potentially also incomplete printed editions, or needing to be affiliated with some kind of institution. For Aby Warburg to work on his atlas in the 1920s, he required an extensive private library, funds, contacts, privileges, and most importantly, a lot of time. Something he had, for this kind of work, something he had because of his academic status and, because of his wealthy family. Being part of an elite was what enabled him to do this kind of work. So my argument is that today, anyone with a laptop, access to an open, and that's important, open internet, and any amount of free time becomes, in a way, part of something like a digital elite. No matter whether they're really rich and powerful or not, it's more of a choice they make themselves. If you look to the past, being extremely rich and powerful was not even the absolute definition of nobility. Instead, it was more about access to a certain network of people, relative personal freedom, and most importantly, time for leisure, because these people weren't forced into manual labor from their childhood on. In that way, our situation today has this unexpected parallel with the life documented in these medieval and early modern sources being digitized right now. For the longest time, literacy was of course exclusive to these elites, so the books and paintings offer a completely distorted perspective on society. If I ask you about the defining music of the 60s, for example, you might say something like, I don't know, the Beatles. I mean, everybody knows them, they had a huge influence. But what about the 1460s? Well, somebody who studied all the historical sources might probably say, well, it was the polyphony of Johannes Ockeghem. But to like 99% of his contemporaries who never even got to physically enter the courts where he worked, the sound of the music of Ockeghem was likely more alien than it is to us today, who can just listen to it on YouTube. So this is this crazy change. So if you take this thought process back to the very beginning of my talk, which was the state of early music and the problem of defining its relevance, why we need to research and perform these old repertoires today, it's exactly not a question of national identity or reviving Western culture and coming back to the glorious past exactly as it was, but the realization that technology has reinstated and will reinstate several framework conditions of courtly life and culture into our modern everyday reality. I believe that this is what really gives new relevance to the contents of these digitized archives. The question is how we as digital cultures will shape and inhabit our virtual gardens, chapels, and palaces. Thank you very much.
We have already reached the end of this episode, but there are still some things I'd like to say, so as always, I reserved a little extra time. And the first thing that I'd like to say is a big thank you to the entire team behind the Digital Cultures Conference, who invited me to Warsaw last week to be one of the many international speakers from all kinds of industries and academic branches who presented their work there. And it was really a fascinating group of people I got to meet, people at the forefront of the digital revolution, developing virtual reality software or making video art, curating video exhibitions or online archives. And that's also how Memo, project about old stuff, fit into a futuristic conference like that. I was invited as a kind of case example for how this entire digitization process of old materials could find its end user. And the task of having to present the project Memo to a group of people who are not at all from this entire early music or art history world also helped me define and understand much better what I want to do with this project. I really believe that this concept that I speak about in my keynote of a digital court culture might be a possible answer to this question for relevance of the work we're doing with early music. And even though I didn't really get to speak about it in the keynote, I also believe that a natural extension of this idea is also the concept of crowdfunding or, digital patronage. Because after all, cultural production at these courts was never meant for huge demographics on an industrial scale, but always for specific communities, groups of people who then enabled the production of this culture through patronage. And this, of course, is a good transition to the next main point I wanted to get to, which is my moment to thank all the people who have been supporting this project Memo over the last weeks and months, and at this point even years, on patreon.com, which is a website that allows you to become a patron to Memo by pledging a small amount, something like the price for a cup of coffee in your home country, which will then be automatically donated to the project whenever I release another episode of Memo. And all these micro donations together form something like a salary, in turn enabling me to invest more time and effort into future episodes. So here on the side you see everybody who has been supporting Memo up until now, and to those I simply want to say thank you. Another thank you goes out to Memo's first sponsor, who's been with the project from the very beginning. It's the online string service Cuerdas Pulsadas, where you can order all kinds of strings, not only for lutes, but virtually any kind of stringed instrument. If you'd like to find out more about the project, perhaps become a new patron to Memo, or simply have a look at all the previous episodes, you can find all these things on Memo's own website, which is musicamemo.com, where you can also sign up to Memo's own newsletter, which will inform you by email whenever I release a new episode. So I suppose the only thing that's really left to say at this point is that I hope you enjoyed this episode and that you'll be joining me again for the upcoming installment of Memo.